Are you making the old-fashioned wrong? We'll find out today on this inaugural episode of Curious Cocktails. Welcome back to the Arcane Opal, folks. I'm Greg of Grego Movie Rant, and this is the pilot episode of Curious Cocktails, the cocktail show where we get into all sorts of mixed drinks, from the old staples to modern classics, getting into the history, the recipes, and everything you need to know to make the best mixed drinks possible. We're gonna start this cocktail journey off right, and there's no better way to do that than with talking about the original cocktail, the proto-cocktail. You might even call it the ur-cocktail if you're a snob, like myself. Of course, we're talking about the old-fashioned. The old-fashioned is not only one of the most important cocktails to the craft, but it's also one of the most popular. Up until very recently, it was the most sold cocktail in all bars across the world, up until the Negroni started making a vie for the top crown. And as with many classic cocktails, there is of course intense debate onto how to make an old-fashioned the correct way. But in order to figure that out, we gotta get into the history. Now, to understand what makes the old-fashioned an old-fashioned, we first have to explore the history of the cocktail. Not cocktails, the cocktail. You see, the term cocktail wasn't always this umbrella term for mixed drinks that usually involve alcohol. In fact, it used to be a very specific drink, just the cocktail. It is the definitive drink that dominated bar culture throughout the 1800s. Now, of course, there were mixed drinks before the cocktail was invented. Of course, you had punch in Britain and America, you had all sorts of beers and meads and wines, you had grog, which was a mixture of rum, lime, and water to help prevent scurvy amongst the British Navy. But the cocktail is really where we get our understanding of mixed drinks as an art form, much like cooking. There's many apocryphal stories surrounding the cocktail. Nobody really knows who invented it, and even the name itself doesn't have an origin that is fully settled upon. It's pretty widely agreed upon now that the name cocktail came from a very unsavory practice in the horse industry. You see, when a horse seller wanted to sell a horse that was of lesser than desired health, they would take a stick of shaved ginger root and shove it up there behind, which would cause their tail to perk up and thus make them look more healthy than they actually were. If this name origin is correct, then that would mean this is a sly reference to the fact that when you have a cocktail, it sort of perks you up, like the tail of a horse that has had ginger shoved up its ass. Here's the thing with the cocktail. The recipe is very simple and straightforward. It's just spirit, bitters, sugar, and water. That's it. You might have noticed that's a very vague recipe, and that's entirely on purpose. You see, the United States was not as connected as it is today, and as a result, you don't know what ingredients you might have on hand to make a cocktail depending on where you are. In one town you might have better access to whiskey, but in the next town over you might have better access to gin. The kinds of bitters that were available from town to town will be different as well, and lots of bartenders started switching out sugars for all sorts of complex syrups. Other bartenders started adding even more variation, with new ingredients getting added to their cocktails, such as absinthe, vermouth, and curacao. Not to mention, the cocktail had an element of class divide. Most people, your average worker, were only getting your cocktails watered down with straight up room temperature water. But if you were rich or hanging out in one of these fancy hotel bars, you were getting your cocktails on ice. You have to remember that refrigeration was not the common luxury we have today. Rather, back in the day, if you wanted a cold drink, you had to have your ice delivered. And it wasn't gonna last very long, because 9 times out of 10 you were putting that in your ice box to make sure that the milk didn't go bad before the afternoon was over. So, if you wanted a cold drink, you better be rich. The result is that the cocktail was different from state to state, city to city, and even from bar to bar. Because the vague recipe for the cocktail invited variation, this meant that wherever you went, you were effectively ordering the house cocktail, a lot like ordering the house salad. One of the most popular variations of the cocktail is now known as the improved whiskey cocktail, but that's a drink for another time. Pretty soon that simple recipe of spirit, bitters, sugar, and water became more complex as enterprising bartenders started adding their own variations to the recipe. Eventually, a lot of these variations on the cocktail ended up getting spun off into their own unique recipes like the Sazerac and the Manhattan, which are classics in their own right. As is often the case, whenever something new catches hold in mainstream culture, there's of course a loud and vocal subset of people who proclaim that the old way was better, and the cocktail was no different than this. Now, to these people's credit, you didn't really know what you were gonna get in your cocktail until you had it in front of you. Now, sure, you could have ordered a whiskey cocktail or a gin cocktail and that would have helped you out, but unless you ask the bartender, you don't know what their house cocktail is. You don't know if they're using white sugar or demerara sugar. You don't know if they're using sugar or syrup. You don't know, maybe they might muddle a whole fruit salad into your drink and that's not up to your taste. So around the 1870s to 1880s, you start to see this rising trend where people were ordering cocktails the old-fashioned way. Now the name old-fashioned is of course going back to that original recipe, the spirit, the bitters, the sugar, and the water. However, it's also kind of a misnomer. because a lot of these folks who were ordering their cocktails the old-fashioned way clearly had no problem with their drink being served on ice. You know, ice, that thing that was a newfangled addition to the cocktail, something for rich people and city slickers. They had no problem with that. They also didn't have a problem with fruit peels being added in as a garnish, but, you know, to each their own. Now listen here, Mr. Bartender, I don't know how you make your cocktails around here, but I'm gonna tell you right now, I don't want your fancy syrups, I don't want your fruit juices, I don't want you to muddle a fruit salad in my cup, none of that crazy newfangled stuff. I want a cocktail the old-fashioned way. Spirit, bitters, sugar, and water. Preferably in the form of ice, because I like a cold drink. The old-fashioned might have gained popularity through its nostalgic bend, but it is a very popular drink for a reason. It is perfect for people who like strong, stiff drinks, it is a great way to emphasize an already great spirit, it is just an overall great people-pleaser cocktail, especially if the spirit you use is up to par. The Old Fashioned is also the heart of what I would call one of the best books in the mixology hobby right now, Imbibe by David Wondrich. There's a reason why every YouTube bartender worth their salt recommends this book. For those of you not aware, Imbibe is basically an annotated version of Professor Jerry Thomas's Bartender's Guide, and if you've never heard of Professor Jerry Thomas, I am happy to introduce him to you. He is effectively the earliest known celebrity bartender, and he is worthy of his own deep dive exploration in a future video, so make sure you're subscribed for when that video comes out. I got a show for myself, nobody's sponsoring this show yet. I'd also be remiss not to mention that the Old Fashioned is one of the core 6 recipes found in the Cocktail Codex by Death & Company. Now, this cocktail tome makes a very interesting argument, a persuasive argument I might add, that being that there are only 6 cocktail recipes, and every other cocktail, all of them, the ones that you know, the ones that you've had, are just variations of the core 6. Which, that's kind of how recipes work, but it's an argument that's well made in this book. Again, I'm not sponsored, just tipping my hat, like, comment, and subscribe, all that good stuff. Now, if you'll connect some dots from our little history lesson, you'll notice that the Old Fashioned is a cocktail that is derived from a very simple recipe, a deceptively simple recipe, and was built from a culture of people who were very particular about how they like their drinks. So that has led to a lot of discussion and debate and discourse surrounding the Old Fashioned, and there's a particular subset of Old Fashioned fans who are kind of gatekeepy about making this drink, and will get very, very huffy if you don't make it exactly the way they personally like it. And to the credit of old-fashioned snobs everywhere, the old-fashioned recipe is deceptively simple. If you add too much sugar, it becomes too sweet. If you add too much spirit, it's just firewater. It is a recipe that is easy to make, but difficult to master. That takes us back to the question that started this video: how do you make an old-fashioned the right way? Well, we have to break the recipe down to its 4 core components: the spirit, the bitters, the sugar, and the water. What kind of spirit should you use? Most people will expect whiskey in their old fashions. It's kind of an unspoken rule. A lot of people say that you must use bourbon, but rye will also work. And just as a note, it's not ahistorical to use gin in your old fashions, but I would specify that you're making a gin old fashioned. Whiskey is kind of the unspoken standard. What kind of bitters should you use in an old fashioned? Bitters are effectively the salt, pepper, and spice to your cocktails, and when it comes to the old fashioned, most people are going to expect an aromatic bitters. Now you might be asking yourself, Greg, aren't all bitters aromatic? And yes, technically, but in this case, the term aromatic is a label for a specific kind of bitters. Aromatic bitters are a very specific kind of bitters. They are often made in an old-style way, and they are made with a top-secret recipe most of the time. They often include lots of spices, herbs like gentian root, wood barks of all sorts of kinds. You know what aromatic bitters taste like once you've had them. They're slightly herbal, leaning more towards bitter notes, and they just add so much to a cocktail. That being said, you shouldn't be restricted to just aromatic bitters. Whatever bitters you have on hand is going to add a unique variation to your old-fashioned. If you want to emphasize citrus notes, use your orange bitters. You can use chocolate bitters or spicy bitters if you want to add some different flavor notes into your drink. Really, the world is your oyster depending on what bitters you have on hand. What kind of sugar should you use in your old-fashioned? This is, in my opinion, the most divisive part of the whole old-fashioned debate. Most people will insist that you use a sugar cube, and yes, that is the traditional way of doing that, and it's great if you're only making 1 or 2 cocktails. However, if you're entertaining guests at home and have to make 3, 4, 5, 6 cocktails, or you work in a bar environment, I highly suggest that you at least consider using some kind of syrup instead. Simple syrups will do just fine in an old-fashioned. A simple syrup is 1 part sugar to 1 part water. It's just an easy way to get sugar in your drink. However, with an old-fashioned, I would recommend that you use a rich simple syrup, which is 2 part sugar to 1 part water, because that is shelf-stable and what they would have been able to use back in the 1800s. So it's more historically accurate. And if you're using syrups, you have even more ways to add variations to your old-fashioned. You could use an agave syrup or a gum syrup to add more texture to your drink. You can use a honey syrup to add some more natural flavors to your drink. Really, when you're using syrups, you have a lot more variation than when you just use sugars. If you're using sugar in an old-fashioned, there is some debate on whether you should use white sugar or demerara sugar, and really, that's up to preference. White sugar has a more clean taste, it's just straight up sugar. Demerara sugar has a bit more flavor and in some cases more texture. You have those slight molasses notes when you use demerara sugar. Either way, sugar is sugar, it should be fine in your drink. And finally, what kind of water or ice should I use in my old-fashioned? Most people prefer having their old-fashioned on ice. If you do that, it's recommended that you get some kind of ice tray that lets you make these big square blocks of ice. Those are going to look really classy in your drink, especially if you're able to make it clear. Which, there's methods to do that aren't fancy, but I don't really have the freezer space to do that, so my ice is going to be slightly cloudy. Deal with it. You can use crushed ice or smaller ice cubes if you want to, but that just means that you're going to have a more diluted drink, so you're going to do less sipping on your old-fashioned and more chugging, if that makes sense. If you want to have an old-fashioned the non-refrigerated way, using just plain old filter water should suffice if you want to have it the poor man's way. But if you want to be really weird about your water, using like a seltzer water to make it a little bit bubbly would make your old-fashioned really interesting. As for the garnish, orange and lemon is what's expected. Don't sweat it if you can only find one or the other, although in my experience, orange is what's usually called for in the old-fashioned. So with all these considerations, what is the best way, the definitive way to make an old-fashioned the way that you like it? Look, don't get me wrong, I like traditions as much as the next guy, but at the end of the day, it's your drink, you should enjoy it. So with all these factors laid out, let's make the old-fashioned the way I like to do it. We're gonna build our old-fashioned in the glass. And to do that, you're going to need your favorite whiskey, preferably bourbon, aromatic bitters, a sugar cube, an orange with a citrus peeler for the garnish, you'll need a muddler or a bar spoon with one, a jigger to measure, and your ice. We're gonna start off with our cheap ingredients first, that way if we make a mistake, we don't have to pour out any of our expensive liquor. So first, grab your sugar cube and drop it in the glass. You're gonna add 2 dashes of bitters, trying your best to soak the sugar cube. Next, you're going to take your muddler, or the muddling end of your bar spoon, and go ahead and crush up your sugar cube. It just completely falls apart in there. Then you're going to add 2 ounces of your whiskey. Ah, love the sound of a good cork. Try not to spill it. Then you're going to take your ice cube and use your bar spoon to gently lower it into the drink. There we go. Give it a stir. Finally, we are going to get our orange peel over the drink, squeeze the last of the oils in, and then drop the peel in the drink itself. Squeeze. Stir it into the drink. And that, my friends, is an old-fashioned. Cheers. God, it's so good. It's obviously a strong spirit-forward drink, so the spirit is the star of the show. So you want to make sure that whatever spirit you choose to use in your old-fashioned is one you enjoy sipping neat. The bitters and the sugar are helping elevate the flavors in this drink, and you can even get a little bit of the orange thanks to the oils that we expressed over the drink, as well as the orange peel itself. This is a classic for a reason. It's the cocktail, the old-fashioned cocktail. And I hope whatever old-fashioned you made at home is just as good as the one I have in my hand. Let us know what you thought of this episode of Curious Cocktails in the comment section down below, and don't forget to drop a like or dislike. Don't forget to subscribe for future episodes of this show and many other projects that we have coming down the pipeline, because we've got lots of stuff on the way that you won't want to miss. Until next time, I've been Greg, you've been you, this has been Curious Cocktails, and have the day you deserve. Cheers. Still so good.